shape, we could do that.
That was a lovely talk by Gretchen, describing in a very personal way Bob's influence on her work. And of course, she's not alone. When I begin to reflect on it, I think about the dozens and dozens of graduate students who worked with Bob in one capacity or another, sometimes with Bob on a dissertation committee, sometimes working with him on a project, sometimes simply asking for advice, sometimes just watching Bob as he sat over a sandwich often brought from home and talked at an informal lunch gathering about ideas, listening, always listening, offering a thoughtful suggestion only after he'd heard everything that the student or the colleague had said, always doing it with enormous grace and respect. And we were talking during the break, several of us, about the ways in which some very, very unusual people influence the climate and culture of an organization long past their active involvement in the organization. It's a bit of a mystery even to those of us who study organizations and wonder how that could come to be. How can a single individual influence how an organization thinks about itself, how it acts on the environment, how it seeks resources, how it thinks about its colleagues and employees? How does that happen that a single individual or perhaps a couple of individuals can shape that long after a person's presence has changed or they've gone? Well, I think we have here at Michigan and at ISR probably one of the most powerful examples I've ever seen of that sort of thing. And by the way, if you reflect on that for a minute, you'll realize that this can happen in positive ways, as Gretchen pointed out, but it can happen in negative ways as well. And enough said about that. I am actually going to share some thoughts about Bob's work and Bob and Dan Katz's work. And then I'm also going to say a little bit about what I think of as Bob's radiating influence on not just the Institute for Social Research, but on a much wider range of arenas in which he's made enormous contributions to our world of social science and beyond that as well. And at the end of that, I promise that there is another speaker, and I'll introduce him briefly later, who will be coming to us via video, named Bob Sutton, who is another of Bob Kahn's students, and who is now a professor at Stanford University, who couldn't come because of an illness. I'll explain that later, but who very passionately wanted to come, and in fact will share some very personal thoughts about Bob with us later. So I'm going to begin by simply, in some ways, coming at a bit of what Gretchen said in a slightly different way, thinking in particular about Bob and Dan Katz's contribution that they made in writing the very important book, The Social Psychology of Organization. I'm going to come at it slightly differently because I think the intellectual contribution was so powerful that it deserves some special attention. Katz and Kahn, The Social Psychology of Organizations. Bob and Dan did together, and it was probably Bob's first real masterwork with Dan under Dan's tutelage. But he became an equal partner in this enterprise, and one who has, I think, in some powerful ways carried on the intellectual tradition that is implicit in that particular book. In fact, I would want to say that something even more ambitious about this particular work. This work that Bob and Dan created was truly paradigm-breaking work that produced revolutionary change in the way we conceptualize organizations. Not only how organizations are, but how they work as well. Let's take a look for a moment at the way the earlier paradigm directed our attention and our thinking. It's a familiar chart. Versions of it we've seen, in fact, standard until very recently, as a way of conceiving what an organization is and what it does. Now, what's notable about it is pretty obvious when you think about it. It's deeply hierarchical. The influence, it's all about power. It's all about power flowing down from the head of the organization to its various constituent membership. And in fact, it seems to be isolated somewhere in an unknown space without connections to anything else in the world. And in fact, it's hard now, I think, for us to understand how powerful and dominant that conceptualization of organizations was just 50 years ago. It was extraordinary. It's still quite popular in military circles, by the way. But in fact, this was the existing paradigm. And so if most of you have read Kuhn's path-breaking book on paradigms and conceptual revolutions in science, and I'm wanting to claim, and I think it's a safe ground to stand on, I'm wanting to claim that Dan and Bob's book was in fact a paradigm-busting change in the way we conceptualize organizations. Organizations as hierarchies seem to stand alone, and they were the normal science. They were the normal science of organizational scholarship not so long ago. So I'll repeat a bit of what Gretchen said from a slightly different point of view, because I think it's worth reflecting on. The social psychology of organizations, Bob's and Dan's book, was revolutionary in a lot of ways. At first, at the time that book was conceived, open systems theory, the idea of any entity interacting with its environment, organizations in this case, that continuously interact with their environment, that's their essence. That's their essence. Is a fundamental change in the way we think about organizations. The book by itself didn't stop there, and I'm going to go into this a little bit, but it didn't just say, this is a new way to think about organizations. It also said, if we take systems theory seriously, this is a new way to think about leadership, and we'll look at that. And even how we conceive of roles in organizations, and even organizational effectiveness. And of course, Gretchen mentioned this earlier, and you'll hear more of it later. In the same context, this book began to trace ideas about how organizational demands affect the health and well-being, a conceptualization much broader than health as it had previously been thought about. And beyond that, it even began to hint at the relevance of organizational thinking to international affairs. Enormously ambitious, enormously path-breaking, truly although sometimes the notion of paradigm busting gets a bit overused. In this case, I think there's absolutely no question that this book did that. And the new paradigm, we saw an earlier version of that, but this is the quintessential statement. For me, this is the statement that says everything that changed the way we think about organizations. They said, organizations should be conceptualized as open systems that require interaction among component parts, and interaction with the environments to survive. So there's an implicit kind of evolutionary concept hiding underneath this apparently mechanistic, servo-mechanism-oriented way of thinking about organizations. It's very interesting. It was a moment of intellectual change in our thinking, and they were powerful contributors to it. So what did this look like? We saw a version of that. This is another version of it. The new paradigm, remember the old paradigm is this hierarchy. This is about, imagine this as a team, as an organization, at almost any level of analysis. This is an organizational conception in which the inputs are the things that an organization must seek. They're the resources it needs to survive. It has to do something with them. It has to transform them. That's what organizations do, and it has an output. And the output is not necessarily widgets. It can be people. A number of the things that Bob contributed to and others have to do with how human service organizations transform the lives of people, and that the throughput of them are the programs that they produce, and the output are, we hope, the enhanced lives and competencies of individuals. So this is not just about factories. This is about organizations writ large. And of course, the fundamental mechanism is feedback. Feedback which both feeds and transforms the organization. So this is, I can't tell you, one of the reasons I can't tell you how astonishing this was, is that as Thomas Kuhn argued, when something is really revolutionary and it changes the way we think, it suddenly becomes not something separate and something special, but part of the everyday thinking of all people who work in a field. So when that happens, the whole idea that Bob and Dan created here was an idea that we now take for granted as something obvious, but it was far from obvious at that time. That's what happens when the new paradigm emerges in the field and really change it dramatically. So let me say, just hint at a couple of the ways in which this general way of thinking about organizations and organizational processes informed other aspects of things. One of the things that I think is probably least well appreciated today and is incredibly important is our understanding about roles in organizations. Somehow it began to recede when macro social scientists began to conceive of organizations in a much larger context, and it began to get less interest when micro-organizational psychologists began to go inside. Psychologists are to blame for this, to drive organizations inside the head of the individual. So many organizational psychologists have gone in that cognitive direction. And yet, one of the essences of organizations is what happens, for example, in a team, and how one thinks about how roles interact in the team. And this conceptualization has, if you just look at it for a second, you begin to see that it has this system-like quality, that it includes ideas about the attributes of the individual. So certainly individuals influence what a role looks like. But there are people out there called role senders who send their expectations to the focal member of the role set. And those expectations influence how the role is done. Now, think about this when you think about what I think you could, if you went to the University of Michigan today and you looked at the Human Resources website, I'm just guessing about this, but I'll put my money on it, you'll still find job descriptions. And what is a job description? It's a list of stuff that people do. They do this, they do that, they do this, they do that. But that's not really a dynamic description of a role in an organization. This is a dynamic description of a role in an organization. And extraordinary in that way. Of course, they went beyond simply thinking about roles. They also began to think about leadership. In some ways, if you begin to think about leadership in systems terms, it looks quite different, because then you still have to retain some core understanding about what's the input in this system, what's the throughput of the process, and what's the output. And in this case, if you look at this is Katz and Kahn's notion of leadership. The inputs are, of course, the raw material, people, and information. But for the input of a leader is what they do, what they input to the team, influencing, envisioning, inspiring, motivating, giving long-term direction. Those are the inputs in this process. The team, of course, then is oriented toward a goal, and the output is achieving the goal. And, of course, in any team, whether it's a team in the military, a team in manufacturing, a brainstorming team, we teach a lot of our courses now by dividing our students into subgroups called teams. And we hope that we have some reasonably good conceptualization of what kinds of things we do as leaders of those teams, and that the output is something more elevating than what we began with. But this is a very powerful way of thinking about leaders. And beyond that, I want to shift gears briefly to talk about one other aspect of Bob's work. This is the kind of work that Bob did that was this paradigm-busting work about organizations. But when you think about Bob's work, you have to go much more broadly. You have to begin to think about what else he did, not just in ISR, but also throughout the University of Michigan and beyond the University of Michigan. Major foundations with major scientific committees and a variety of other things. And I want to mention those because although, of course, the heart of all he did was here at the Institute for Social Research, so much he gave us so much more, and he gave the University of Michigan and other organizations so much more. So let me begin to do that. Of course, and I'm just going to mention these briefly and then talk a little bit about each of them. He built more than a little at the Institute for Social Research, but the Social Environment and Health Program, I think, at least represents a signal example of the kinds of things he did and how he did it. I want to talk a little bit about that. And I hope others will chime in, because I see in this room a number of people who both shared and led that organization in different generations and profited from it as I did. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the Interdisciplinary Committee on Organizational Studies, because that was a remarkable achievement, and still going. And then he began, and we heard a fair amount, and I'll only mention it briefly, his work with bureaucratic encounters to begin to conceptualize what it was that those government organizations did and how did they do it. And that was extraordinarily rich work. And then, of course, Tony will probably say a lot more about this and others, but his work with the MacArthur Foundation, I'm going to speak to only a small piece of that, which has to do with a special assignment that he had toward the end of his work there, which is, I think, important and interesting. So let me just say a couple of things to begin with. The social environment and health programs are kind of the living research teams or clusters of research teams at the Institute for Social Research, as almost everyone here knows. That's where the real action happened. Those teams, which often had memberships that came and went, that often had a core group of both staff and faculty who worked closely together, both on the technology of the research that was going to be done, but also on the conceptualization, and also reached across the campus, were actually the heart and soul of what really goes on at the Institute for Social Research. And I was privileged, and others here were privileged to be part of the social environment and health system, founded by Jack French and Bob and Floyd Mann in the early 60s. has always focused on something that both Jim and others mentioned, and that is the role of psychosocial factors in mental and physical health and illness. What's interesting about this particular group is not only what an astonishing array of first-rate scholarship has been produced by it, as well as empirical research and lots of data sets that are still being used around the world, but it also that it's now in a new incarnation. There are new leaders, new topics, new problems. Now there are scholars from all of the fields that are listed there. I won't read them to you. That's pretty obvious. And it still houses important studies. And some people are still active, like Jim, is still active in social environment health program. In the American Changing Lives study, National Neighborhood Data Archive is now part of this. And important new work, particularly work on issues having to do with racism. And it continues to a tradition that was started long ago of training doctoral students in one of what I think of as the ideal kinds of contexts in which you can learn the craft of what we do. And the only way you can really learn it is through doing and through exposure. That's a very special aspect of what Bob gave to ISR. But I want to say something about something that Gretchen also mentioned, and that is ICOS, the Interdisciplinary Committee on Organizational Studies. Mayor Zold and Bob really were the founders of that. I was a junior partner. I was a gopher in that group. One day, long ago, about 1980, I think, Bob and Mayor and I were having lunch, the usual brown bag of sandwiches, and Bob and Mayor started looking at each other and said, "No, there are a lot of people at the University of Michigan who are doing organizational scholarship, and we don't talk to each other. There are folks in engineering. There are people in public health. There are people in the business school, obviously. There are people in sociology. And these folks are just sitting in separate little places and not talking with each other." And it so happens it's also a time when the field of organizational scholarship didn't have a single paradigm that governed it. On the contrary, there were dozens of different ways of framing what an organization was, from macro institutional approaches all the way through micro cognitive approaches. And none of these people were talking to each other. None of these people were really trying to bridge the gap. They were quite comfortable in their own very small arena, not really being challenged, or reaffirming and celebrating their own cleverness within their own homogeneous group. And yet, there was a possibility to get this conversation going. So Bob and Mayor said, well, we should probably make this invite people in, but we should just start small. So let's just invite some colleagues in. And we had a couple of meetings with sandwiches and 7 or 8 people around the table, some over here and some other places. And pretty soon it became clear that among the people who were having the conversation that we needed to have the graduates, at least a couple of them, to join the crowd. And they did invite. That's when they drew the line. They said, this is really going to be a kind of professional conversation and exchange. There's enough divergence in points of view here. There's enough opportunity for exchange that let's just keep it here. And they did. And so the seminar went on for about a year or so, and we started to say, well, we really should start bringing our colleagues from other places in the country. I have a friend at Northwestern. You have a friend at the University of Chicago. You have a friend at Berkeley, and so on. We didn't have any money. We just had a coffee pot. and that was donated and later ably maintained by Jerry Davis, as a matter of fact. But we had just a coffee pot, and that was all. And so we said, well, who's going to fund this? We're all fairly entrepreneurial. Let's fund it. And Bob said, I think we should just get a tin cup
We should start going to the deans. Just tell them what's going on.
I couldn't believe it.
Should we do that?
Mayor said, oh, why not? And so off we went, and we knocked on doors of deans, and we said, we want to tell you something really extraordinary is going on. It's this funny gathering. It's this is a Michigan thing. It's interdisciplinary, crosses boundaries. It's getting people together, intellectual ferment, very special. But we don't have any money for anything but another pot of coffee. And we want to bring in scholars from all over the country. And I can't believe it, but deans literally started writing checks, personal checks, calling up saying, we want a new allocation for such and such. Later, that grew into a very generous kind of contribution from the business school, sustained for long periods of time. The point was, if there ever was grassroots funding for an intellectual enterprise, it came from Bob and Mayer. And it's one other piece of that. I don't see it here, but it so happened in that era, the president of the university had decided that there should be a prize for a really path-breaking innovative scholarship. And it so happened that we knew one of the people in the president's office that was responsible for this figure, and who probably should remain nameless, who also knew what we were up to. And lo and behold, that year we got the prize, which funded us for 3 years to begin to bring people in. So very much a grassroots enterprise. It still is. You saw a number of the leaders listed by Gretchen. I think of Jane Dutton in particular, and Jerry Davis in particular, and others as well. The content has changed. The cast of characters has changed. But this is a vital organization, but a classic Michigan organization in the sense that it is grassroots, interdisciplinary, and quite voluntary, and yet enormously rich and flourishing still. I was going to mention, there are a couple of things about it that are worthwhile. It's grown in its ambitions a great deal. There's a weekly seminar, which was, of course, the heart of it forever, but also workshops for graduate students, nurturing of people at the point at which they're most vulnerable when they're trying to develop their dissertations. We now, and by the way, if you look up ICOS online, you can find a video library with literally hundreds of outstanding scholarly presentations back from 1997 going forward. And I think Michael Cohen was the person who actually put that together. And of course, coming back to the Institute for Social Research, we also, and thanks to Dan Demison, who helped make this happen, the Lickard Prize for the best dissertation on an organizational topic. So this is very much a special part of Bob's life. It always was. He was always very quiet and modest about it, but it is another example of the way in which his work built on and actually enhanced the intellectual life of the whole university. I want to end briefly before I introduce our next speaker. Barbara said plenty about bureaucratic encounters, but this was a powerful document, and one which actually changed the way a lot of people thought about government service and government organizations. I only mention it, I don't want to take much time, but extraordinary thing. I want to mention one other thing, something that hasn't been mentioned very much. Bob Kahn had an extraordinarily wry sense of humor. He was someone who, if you listen closely, in a massively understated way, managed to say something that almost made you do a cognitive double take. That all of a sudden, you realized that in his own quiet way, he had encapsulated something beautiful and true and funny. And so I was looking through some of the old documents, and I thought, I wanted to say something about one of the special missions that Bob had, which was a mission given to him by the MacArthur Foundation to study the MacArthur Network as a set of organizations where there was allegedly collaboration in its various groups. Now, I have to say one thing. I didn't participate in these groups. I observed some. But these were, the MacArthur Foundation intentionally chose members of each group that were dramatically disparate in their background. So physicists, poets, social scientists, all were sitting on a single committee and were supposed to make some sense out of their mission, which was a stage in the life course of development. And Bob then went around and interviewed large numbers of people in the MacArthur Foundation who were part of this very special group. And one of the things that, I should say, of course, you know that at Michigan and at ISR, if Bob joined a group, somehow it was harmonious, somehow or other people across dramatically different disciplines found ways to talk to each other, especially if there was a grant project or some sort of or a survey that was about to be developed, because then there was something tangible to contribute to. In any case, Bob, in summarizing the history of these networks, MacArthur networks, captured something quite different, at least in the beginning of those collaborations. I'll read it because I think it's so wonderful. He said, the early meetings of networks show a familiar pattern of academic behavior. Successive pronouncements on the subject at hand by various speakers that are heard with varying degrees of attention and comprehension by their listeners. One is reminded of the stance of astronomers at their radio telescopes, listening for signs of intelligent life elsewhere in the cosmos. More hopeful than optimistic. The understatement and the rest tells you so much about our Bob and about the way he could capture the realities of a particular gathering, a particular organization, a particular reality, a particular enterprise. And so I will say that's the Bob I remember. That's the guy who I learned so much from and feel so grateful to have been part of. Now we're going to shift gears a bit because I want to introduce our next speaker, who is has contributed a video. And I want to say, before I say something formal about introducing Robert Sutton, I want to tell you something personal. I've known Bob since he was a counter-dependent, crazy, brilliant graduate student of Bob's and of mine, but only peripherally of mine, and the student that I had in organizational psychology. And Bob was a renegade. He was he often do things and he come back with something. And I will say one thing I didn't just occurred to me now to mention to you. Bob Kahn was a wonderful mentor for Bob Sutton, but Bob never knew what in the heck he was really doing. and I'll never forget the day that Sutton, after disappearing and claiming he was doing his dissertation, and by the way, Bob was always doing supervising dissertations. Bob Kahn was always supervising dissertations that had something to do with survey, had to do with some of the surveys that he developed and promulgated and the data that were available, but seldom anything that wasn't quantitative in some way. And Sutton arrived, I saw this happen, with a 500-page qualitative manuscript. Here's the first draft, Bob. No supervision, and nothing had been done. And Kahn just looked at him. Looked sort of at me and said, well, let's see what he's got here. And in fact, it turned out to be really a powerful contribution to the scholarship of downsizing in an economic era when downsizing was ravishing our whole economy, and being let off and not knowing where they're going. As the Chinese used to put it, they were leaping into the sea of unknowns. And so that turned out to be an extraordinary document, and let me say something formal about Bob Sutton. Bob Sutton is professor of management science and engineering and a professor of organizational behavior by courtesy at Stanford. He's co-founder of the Center for Work Technology and Organizations, an important group at Stanford. Also co-founder of the Stanford Technology Program, and his studies are of innovation, leadership, and the links between managerial knowledge and organizational action. So very much a Kahn theme all the way through. Sutton's published over 100 articles and chapters on these topics in a variety of different scholarly journals in the organizational scholarship field. He's received the Eugene Grant Award for Excellence in Teaching, outstanding teacher. He's named as one of the 10 professors most influencing contemporary thinking in organizations and behavior. Has received awards from the London Business School, American Management Association. He's a fellow of a very special group called IDEO in California, and does a variety of other things that you might expect from someone like Sutton in California. I will say a word. I called Bob up to come and speak a few months ago, maybe a little less. And it was less than that, maybe 2 months ago. I said, Bob, you've got to come. He said, I can't wait. And then he said, I can't wait. And then he called up later. Just had a bike crash. And I'd broken my pelvis. And I said, oh, wow. This is something I can really empathize with, and I'm so sorry. And he said, but I'm going to come. I'm going to come. I have a special therapist coming in every day. And they say I'm ahead of schedule for progress. And I know when this is going to happen, and I'm going to come. Great, Bob. And I was on the phone with him again and again. And he said, just about 10 days ago, he said, my doctors say I can't come. And he said, come. And I said, there's some other complication, and so they won't let me on a plane. You're not off the hook. I very much want you to be able to at least do a video so we can hear what you have to say. It's important. You'll notice that 2 speakers we've had very personal things to say about Bob and the way he was mentioned. I think that's fitting, and that's really what I was hoping we would be able to accomplish with this. I'm going to move on and sit down and let you hear Bob Sutton talk about his influence. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob Sutton, and I'm sorry I can't be there today to celebrate Bob's life with you. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it, but I'm delighted to talk about all the great things that Bob did during the time that I worked with him. As I was thinking about this little talk, I was thinking of a quote by Red Smith, the famous New York Times sports writer. He had this quote which was essentially that dying isn't the thing. Let's manage that. It's the living that counts. Bob sure lived, and he lived such a long, great life. And certainly Bob had remarkable accomplishments when it came to his academic work. I was especially influenced by his work on organizational stress and social psychology of organizations. And I have my copy here, just as proof. You can see sort of the condition and how beat up it is from all the time I spent reading it, especially in graduate school. And in particular, perhaps the most interesting thing I worked on with Bob for me was a little paper on prediction, understanding, and control as antidotes to organizational stress. And I'll talk a little bit about the intellectual stuff, but for me, there were other things that in many ways were more striking. For starters, I was lucky in the late 70s and early 80s to be at the Institute for Social Research when there was still a bunch of the old great scholars around, old who are now my age. In particular, I think of Dan Katz, whose office was next to me, Stan Seashore, who was just quite a character, Bob Kahn, and Dan Dennison, who I hope is there. Dan and I used to call them the Silver Eagles, who were always so impressed by what they did and the example that they set. And in particular, I worked with Bob most closely during two stretches. One was from about 1979 to about 1983. He was my PhD advisor. And then I was especially fortunate in the mid-1980s and then again in the early 1990s to spend a year working with Bob at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And when I thought about the impact, a number of things struck me that I think were important to share. First one was that although in my first year or two I saw Bob around a lot in Michigan, he didn't really start having an impact until he literally came in and saved me. I won't name names, but I was working with a very oppressive and nasty PhD advisor who was exploiting me. And honestly, Bob came in and saved me intellectually and personally. And really, without Bob's intervention in providing social support, which of course he studied, and helping me in a whole bunch of other ways, I never would have finished my PhD, let alone went on to a 35-year academic career. And just as a model throughout my career, when I see a student who is struggling, I always think, what would Bob Kahn do? The second thing about Bob that really struck me, and it's such a hallmark of his career, is he was so intellectually open. Just about any theory that he ever heard, just about any method, he would, as opposed to having that kind of tribalism that we have in academia where we think that people have different theories or different methods, that they're the enemy or they're stupid, Bob always looked for the good in them and found ways to integrate them in his work. And in my own case, I did what I think was the first qualitative theory that he ever supervised. And he was so open, so excited, and so supportive. And I remember him sending me to Mayor Zold, the late Mayor Zold, who was wonderful, so I could have some adult supervision. That's the thing I learned from Bob is to be more intellectually open than I would have been otherwise. The third thing I learned from Bob, unfortunately this was my fault, was later on in our career, the last time that we worked at the Center for Advanced Study in the early 90s, what I was supposed to be doing was to be helping Bob Kahn and Dan Katz, who was still alive, to revise the classic social psychology of organizations. And honestly, I spent about a year every afternoon trying to figure out how to recast this classic book, and I failed utterly. I wrote all this text, but it was all pretty bad. And in the end, Bob forgave me for that, and I still appreciate that. So that's something that I've also learned. Finally, I also think about little things about Bob that I loved. You know, Rick Price and I were just talking about this. I especially love the language that Bob would use. Some of the things that came to mind. I remember early on having a conversation with Bob that was awkward with all other adults at that time, because I was living with my then girlfriend. The question of living in sin and like how you talked about it was difficult. And I remember it just rolled off of Bob's tongue, and he used this line that was, "How long have you and Marina been a duo?" It just another time he was talking to Stan Seashore, and just they were talking about doing something, and Bob said to Stan, "Well, we're interchangeable for most purposes," and all that sort of language would come out of his mouth. In the statements in some of his writings, I especially remember the definition of organizational norms in organizational stress. And I think he wrote this, which was that organizational norms are those overarching shelts and shalt nots that come to infect organizational member souls. That's such a beautiful way with language, just stunning. Other thing I think of is how gracious Bob was with people in things that drove him crazy for the most part. I remember he had an assistant in front of his office, a temporary assistant, was handing out little red Christian Bibles to those of us who were waiting in line. And I remember how gracious Bob was about that. I also think didn't like him. Who were rude, who were nasty. It really did drive him crazy. Also, disliked waiting. That was something he talked a lot about. And finally, Bob liked to talk too much. So at this point, let me end this. A little bit about why I titled it "The Best Man I Ever Knew." And now, it's been some 40 years since I met Bob Kahn, and still, I'm 65 years old. When I face a difficult personal or intellectual situation, first thing I ask myself, in most cases, is what would Bob Kahn do? So Bob's been with me and in my soul throughout my life, and has helped me enormously. Once again, thank you all so much, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you to celebrate Bob's life.
We're surprisingly close to being on schedule, but we have a chance for any comments or questions or remarks. It's a wonderful time to do it. There'll be plenty of opportunities later. Anybody want to offer a comment? Dan?
There's the microphone so we can hear it in the screen. There are.
Go ahead, Dan. I know I picked on you without warning, but go ahead.
There are so many comments that I'd make, but as Bob Sutton said, Bob didn't like people that went on and talked too much. But the heart and the intellect that showed through the turn of phrase was something that I've never really seen on anybody else, walking on this earth. And the one I remember the best is when Bob spoke at a service honoring Rensis Licker after he had passed away. And Bob was talking about how he had come to the University of Michigan because, we were all astounded as graduate students that he was 40 years old before he began graduate school. But he said that, he was talking about how he came to the University of Michigan and he was drawn here, he said, and this is in Rackham Auditorium, 400 people. He said, well, I came here because I was attracted by the work of Angus Campbell on anti-Semitism. And then in the, just beautiful scholarly repose, a deep breath, starting the next paragraph saying, up to that point in my career, only having been more familiar with practitioners than theorists, I found this compelling, and the drive and the persistence and the fight in him was marvelous, and it's really it's fantastic to be here with so many people that he touched, and thank you for asking me this.
Thank you, Dan. I now realize that one of the things that we've made promises to our colleagues is to be sure that we don't run over onto their time, and we have another the beginning of our third session before we break, and I will just mention it briefly, and I know Tony will say more, but the next segment of our conversation and tribute is contribution to life course and aging research. And Tony, please take the podium, and thank you.
Thank you. This means I don't have to. Okay, as Rick said, this session is called Aging in Life Course. And I will say a few comments by way of introduction, and then since we're on a really tight schedule for this segment, if we have time at the end, there are some comments I'd like to make. First is, as you heard this morning, so many people admired Bob, felt close to him and inspired by him. I think it's wonderful if you remember his demeanor. He was in many ways a very formal person, but yet people had this response to him of feeling close to him and feeling that he was a warm person, and I think that is very accurate. I'm now old enough. I came in my 20s for a postdoc for just 2 years. I'm leaving sometime soon. That was like 1977. But I'm now old enough that I have met and knew most of the people that people have talked about here. And in fact, I was just shocked to see that video of Bob Sutton. And, you know, in my mind, he's still that 30-year-old. And he just said he's 65. But anyway, all those people, it was really a wonderful thing to be reminded of all those people, Angus Campbell and Jack French, and many, many other people who had the values that Jim referred to earlier, who really talked about the values of science and the values of people and the values of working within a group. For many, he was a valued colleague as well, and he was an advisor, and many people mentioned that. And I will mention that my husband, James Jackson, was very sorry to not be able to be here, but he thought of Bob as an advisor when he was an assistant professor and then when he was director of ISR. He really felt that talking to Bob about the good old days, but not in the sense of the good old days, but in the sense of the values, fundamental values of ISR, was very helpful. And they conspired, if you will, about ways to bring that forward to the next generation. And I think each of us here at ISR want to do that, worry about doing that, try to think about ways to do that. I am very privileged to have heard Bob say that I was the person who introduced him to the field of aging. I'm very proud of that. And I will use that as a segue into the beginning of this session, which will be led by Jack Rowe, with whom Bob did some very important work, and with whom there is no one in the field of aging who doesn't know this book that Jack and Bob did together. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jack Rowe.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you, Jim, for all your help in organizing this. One of the predictable characteristics of an event like this is redundancy, and many of the observations that I have you've heard before. Maybe you'll hear from a slightly different lens. And since essentially all my work with Bob was in the context of the MacArthur Foundation networks, you've already heard a description of those. So that'll shorten the time I'm up here considerably, which is everyone will appreciate. As I recall my experiences with Bob, three closely related features come to mind. His authentic generosity of spirit. He seemingly never denied any request from a faculty member, or a student, or an administrator, or a foundation executive. His openness to all ideas, which has been commented on, and particularly his interdisciplinary orientation. And it's this component which was most important for me. You've seen a quotation from a piece he wrote about interdisciplinary work in networks at the MacArthur Foundation from 1995 about radio telescopes, which is a kind of a classic Kahn quote. But I thought there was even a more interesting one, which is less descriptive, in a paper that he wrote in 1994, the year previous to that description of the networks, which demonstrated for me that he came to this interdisciplinarity not just out of kind of curiosity about other fields, but driven by the sense that it was essential. So I quote from a paper called "Interdisciplinary Collaborations Are a Scientific and Social Imperative," 1994. we are well past the point at which the knowledge required to enhance the health and well-being of individuals and communities can come solely from lone investigators trying to unlock nature's secrets, or from the offerings of a single discipline. The myth of the solitary scientist in search of truth is a romantic notion whose continued existence serves as a major barrier to progress and bringing the collective weight of the sciences to bear on the problems of humankind. And the idea that all scientific progress takes place within the boundaries of our current disciplines is historically invalid and counterproductive. But the need for development of sustained collaboration by interdisciplinary groups of active research scientists does not arise only from the urgency of social problems. It is intrinsic to the scientific process itself, and it becomes more acute as the accumulation of scientific knowledge continues. No one person can comprehend the full range of that knowledge. Science is a collective rather than an individual possession. Great stuff, just great stuff, and so well articulated. Now, I first met Bob in 1984 when the MacArthur Foundation turned to me and asked me to assemble a network of scholars, as you've heard, with a particular interest in aging, which they felt had been right, and they were right in this, a neglected area. And as we went around the country holding meetings, auditioning various scholars in different settings, it became immediately obvious that he was a key recruit for this effort. His academic rigor, his advocacy for a comprehensive life course perspective, which had been often missing in much gerontological research, and his natural propensity for interdisciplinary work, and his remarkable capacity to work and play well with others really made him a key member. Others in this group, some of these names will be familiar. David Featherman is here, Marilyn Albert, Dan Blazer, Bert Brim, Carl Kottman, John Nesselrode, Norman Gomersey, Guy McCann, Richard Mose, Teresa Seaman, Ed Schneider. This was a dozen different disciplines, a dozen different people. It was so interesting. And the impact on me was just dramatic. I mean, I had trained in medicine and in internal medicine and a fellowship in kidney diseases. I had trained as a scientist, as a biophysicist and a physiologist, and ran a basic laboratory at Harvard Medical School, which is in Boston, for those of you who don't get east that often. And here I was assembling and trying to chair this group and figure out a research strategy and how to work with disciplines. I was not yet 40 years old. And I had this dramatic experience with this mentor, partner, that really, I think, had a really significant impact on the trajectory of my career and the entire group. And he played an important part in everything we did over the course of a decade. But there are two things that I want to comment on that he and I just did together. In 1987, we decided to write a paper that was based on an observation I had made doing some laboratory work, and which he felt was very relevant to beyond physiological issues into social and other environmental issues. And the basic observation was that when you studied so-called normal human aging, you eliminated people who had diseases, and then the rest of them were the normal human agers, and you saw these dramatic declines in kidney function and blood glucose metabolism and lung function, immune function, cardiac function, et cetera, cognitive function. And the observation was that, there were variations in physiology that were not considered pathologic or diseases that are reasoned may have had adverse effects on other measures, and that they should be maybe eliminated as well. And so instead of just taking out hypertensives, we took out people whose blood pressure seemed a little high, but they didn't meet the criterion for the diagnosis. And when you do that, and you do that for blood sugar and everything else, it turns out that the changes in kidney function that you see with age are much less severe than they were in the normal elderly population. And progressively, you can find that these curves start to flatten out. And you can start to see that there's a kind of pure aging, and then there's what we usually consider to be aging, which is contaminated by these other things. You can also imagine that if a given individual was able to have this pure aging in a number of different characteristics, then he or she might really represent a pure aging syndrome, such as Bob Kahn. So we wrote this paper. We entitled it Human Aging, Usual versus Successful. And here's exactly what happened. Bob said, well, where are we going to submit this, Jack? And I said, I don't know, Bob. I don't know. I'm not even sure there's an idea here. What do you think? We'll go back and forth. He says, well, maybe we should submit it to the Journal of Gerontology. I said, well, why would that particularly interesting, Bob? We're going to. He said, well, Jack, I think it's going to get published there. And I said, well, why do you feel that way? I remember this conversation. He said, well, because you're the editor-in-chief of the journal. And I said, well, there is that. But why don't we have time with this, because, Bob, we're not rushing to print. There's no competition. But it's not like another lab is doing the same. There's no competition here. I said, let's send it to Science. Science? I said, yeah, well, I think, they're not going to publish it. But maybe we'll get some good ideas, good review. We'll run out the flagpole. He says, that's a great idea. So we send it to Science. 2 weeks later, my assistant comes in my office and she says, there's a Dr. Kohlberg on the phone from Berkeley. He says he's the editor of Science magazine. So I do something wrong, The only thing I knew that we hadn't done wrong was plagiarize anybody else, because there's nobody else. So I get on the phone, yes, sir, Dr. Kohlberg. And he says, Dr. Rowe, we have this manuscript. We kind of wonder why you sent this to us. It's on aging. We don't do aging. I said, yeah, I know. And he says, so we really didn't have anybody in the Rolodex to review this. And he said, there are no numbers in this. He said, we publish empirical research. And I said, yes, I know. He said, well, what were you thinking? And I said, well, I'll tell you. And I told him what we were thinking. He says, well, I'll tell you what I did. I gave it, this is exactly how this happened. He said, I gave it to the editorial board because they didn't know who else to give it to. And I read it. They read it. We had an editorial board meeting this week. And we love it. And we think it's important, and we're going to publish it next week with no revisions as the lead article. We were in the right place at the right time. Almost every year, and let me emphasize that piece was a 100% joint effort from the first word to the last word. Almost every year since then, that article is the most cited article in gerontology in the world. And that article has now gotten to the point where it is very high up on the list of the most cited articles ever published in Science magazine. Now, I often say that it's cited so frequently because people hate it, but they have to cite it in order to criticize it. But that may be true. Second example came somewhat later, and it came after the network worked for a decade together, and we did a whole variety of different kinds of work. But let me just mention some of the work that we did. We established a comprehensive battery called the MacBat or the Mac battery that could be used to conduct an assessment of individuals' aging as we saw it. And we applied that to a number of studies. One of the studies we applied it to was a longitudinal study of healthy elderly individuals in a suburb of Boston. And one of the striking things we found was that after 6-year follow-up, if you took really healthy 75-year-olds, sort of the top third of the population, you followed them for 6 years, 25% of them don't change. They don't change. That's 100% of people would expect a very, different degrees of reduction, but don't change. Really? Interesting. The third was we did a study in Sweden in the Swedish National Twin Registry. Ring a bell, David? Where we found that in the 25,000 twins that were over age 75 in the Swedish Twin Registry, followed longitudinally, that there were 1,300 pairs who had been same-sex pairs who had been reared apart since birth. And half of those pairs were identical and half were non-identical. And so with the help of Jerry McClan, one of the network members, and many others, and we were able to evaluate every one of those people, or almost every one of those people, and assess how much of aging was heritable and how much was acquired. And we were able to do that, and that our findings in that regard have been replicated in several other studies, and we consider that to be a very significant piece of information in the field. And then we formulated a kind of study or a paradigm about successful aging based on all these studies. What were the characteristics of aging successfully? There have been 107 published variations of that theory, and a fair amount of interest in it and a fair amount of criticism about it. But this term stuck. The NIA started a grant program on successful aging. The Gerontological Society changed at the last minute the theme of its annual meeting to successful aging. 7 universities established programs and professorships in successful aging. You go to the aging meetings every year, and there's a poster session on successful aging. It just has picked up and has persisted as a theme of work in the field. And so after a decade of that, the foundation came to me and they said, the network is winding down and we want you to write a book for the general public about your work. Here's the book here. And I wasn't particularly interested in doing that because at that point I was the CEO and president of one of the largest academic medical centers in the United States. And I had 50,000 employees and a couple of headaches. And I said, I don't really care about this. And they reminded me that they had given us $20 million over 10 years. And that a few people on the board had mentioned that the foundation was not really promulgating its findings in the real world. And so I said, well, maybe I could do it. I think I have an idea. And I called Bob. And Bob told me that we should do it and that he would do it with me. And again, from the first word to the last word, that was a complete collaboration. We published that book. And it was just a remarkable experience. So Jane Brody of the New York Times wrote 2 reviews of this book, not one. and 2 weeks in a row. Each time she wrote a review, we sold 40,000 copies. And it was a bestseller. You open the New York Times book review and go to the back at the end, you look at the bestsellers, and there it was. I said, "Man, that's a book we wrote." And it really helped to bring a lot of these issues to broader attention of the public and to policymakers. And one of the ways that happened was an idea that I had when the foundation was convincing us to write the book. And I said to Bob, I have this idea, and I talked to him about it, and he refined it a little bit. And I went to the foundation, and I said, well, look, guys, because I knew that one of the characteristics of the foundation was very generous. Number two, they liked us. And number three, they had previously unimagined numbers of American dollars, right? So I said to them, I said, look, if we're going to do this, I want to make sure it works. I want you to promise the publishers, as we were trying to find a publisher, that you will buy 10,000 copies at the retail price, and you will send a copy to the mayor of every city, to every congressman, to the state legislative office of every state, to the president of every university, and so on and so on. And they said, that's a great idea. That would only be if it's $30 a book and it's 10,000. Look, we've already spent $20 million on this. And our whole complaint is that it's not getting out there to the influentials in society. And here's this guy got this idea that we're going to guarantee. So I went to Random House and I said, I have a customer who guarantees they're going to spend, they're going to buy 10,000 copies at full retail value. Well, that changed the discussion completely because they knew they weren't going to lose it, but there was no risk. And so I think that was a part of, what we came up with that works. So to finish, I think the network's work had a tangible, positive impact on the field. It certainly had a tangible, positive impact on the network members. And Bob was a hugely influential component of every aspect of that work, and we all owe him a great debt. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to question.
Yeah, I'd be happy. I apologize. I'm off to a family wedding elsewhere, so I'm right to the airport. But if anybody has any comment or question for me before I go, I'd be happy to respond to them. Or David, do you have anything you?
No, I think I can say that in my own life, I was here as a graduate student, and Bob, of course, was one of the members of the joint program in social psychology, so I knew it somewhat in that context. But I must admit, not as well as I came to know him through the network work. And some of the comments earlier, the quote about the telescope is absolutely right. One of the things I learned from Bob, although I don't think I learned it as well as I should have, as some of you that I also attest, was his ability to sit back, take a lot of stuff in, and then come back to everybody in a very supportive way. And I will say that in my words, and put us all back on course. And yes, Jackson was a wonderful chair of that committee, but Bob was a sidekick, and I learned a great deal from all of that. Thanks to you, and thanks to Bob.
Yeah, it was great. Okay, thanks very much.
We'll now go to sort of the other end of the life course and talk about adolescent and early development with Jerry Bachman, who has been a curator and a long time member of ISR. Jerry.
Along with just staying here, but Rich, that's okay. That counts. This is the point. All right. Well, I want to tell you something about Bob Kahn that many of you don't know. He played a vital role starting more than a half century ago in launching what became first the Youth and Transition Study, which then led to Monitoring the Future, which is now well into its fifth decade and has grown substantially since it began. Now, I first met Bob in the spring of 1962 when I was very young, very wet behind the ears, and about to finish my PhD. I came to Ann Arbor to apply for a job with Arnie Tannenbaum, studying control and organizations. And in the process, I was interviewed by Arnie, of course, and also by Ren Lickert, founding director of ISR, and Angus Campbell, director of SRC, and also Bob Kahn. And I remember Bob as very warm and genuinely interested in what I had been doing for my dissertation. Thank goodness they hired me. It was the only job for which I applied. Those were the days. Now, fast forward a couple of years, Arnie announced that his grant was ending. He was going on sabbatical, and if I wanted to stay at SRC, I should start looking for something else to do here. Soon after that, fortunately, Bob Kahn sent out word that he had an invitation to submit a proposal to the Labor Department for a longitudinal study of young men in the Job Corps. Was anyone interested? Well, I allowed that I was, and we spent some exciting hours with Bob putting together a proposal to the Labor Department, and we waited a long time and heard nothing. Bob eventually asked a knowledgeable friend in the Department of Education if she knew what was happening with our proposal. She said she thought the Labor Department was not going to do the study after all. But she asked if we wanted to do it for them because her division needed to get some money spent before the end of the fiscal year. Those really were the days. Well, of course, we couldn't do the Job Corps study for the Department of Education, but our proposal could readily become a study of the causes and consequences of dropping out of high school. She thought that sounded good. When Bob called her a week or two later to see if she really meant it, she said, yes, but you need to do it right away. So we did. We spent a pleasant but intense day or two that weekend at the Kahn House working on the new dropout proposal. Now, not too long after that, we learned that the study was funded, thus an early example in my career of the value of opportunism in funding survey research. Is a particularly valuable trait in organizations like SRC and ISR. This new dropout study was focused on young men only because male and female causes of dropping out were considered to be largely different and because the original Job Corps design had involved males only. We told ourselves and others who compared about our gender discrimination that we could do a female dropout study later. And we were actually able to do that, albeit decades afterward, but that comes later in my story. Our dropout proposal was accepted, and what eventually came to be called the Youth and Transition Study began with a planning year in 1965. But then Bob announced that he was going on sabbatical at MIT, and so he left the planning mostly in my hands. I did get to go to Cambridge at least once to spend a couple of days with Bob and Bea, mostly working on the project, but also enjoying their company as they showed me around Cambridge. In addition to helping plan the Youth and Transition project at a distance, Bob made a very important personnel contribution. Lloyd Johnston was working on his MBA at Harvard and was also taking one of Bob's classes at MIT. Lloyd had by then decided to change career plans and pursue social science. Bob recruited Lloyd to come to Michigan as a graduate student in psychology, and that also to work on youth in transition. That turned out to be a great move for all. 2 years after the first data collection, we wrote Volume 1 in the Youth in Transition book series, published by ISR. And now let's see if I can make this work. Did. All right, and there's Volume 1 in that series, with Bob as the second author. And that publication turned out to be a bit controversial. It was controversial because we proposed that it be typeset, which a half century ago involved some additional cost. Now, you may recall, some of you, Angus Campbell, then the SRC director, was notorious for his frugality. And he thought it was unnecessary to have a typeset and that we could just use a typewriter and have it photocopied. After all, he pointed out, this first volume didn't even include any data. It just had the design and the measures used in the initial data collection. Well, Bob and I objected to the typewriter option, so Angus told us we could appeal his decision to the SRC Agenda Committee, which served as a kind of an executive committee ahead of our current SAC. So we did, and we met with the Agenda Committee, and Bob argued for typesetting so it would be seen as a real book. The late Warren Miller, who was, I think, not a great enthusiast of SRC and ISR's publishing program, but in any case was impatient with all this, and soon after we started our pitch, Warren said, "I vote yes." Well, we talked a bit more and said something about typesetting, producing a book of real quality, and Warren said, "I vote for quality." Soon after that, the Agenda Committee voted unanimously to let us go ahead and have the book typeset. And Angus was gracious in his defeat, but said something to the effect that your open-handed colleagues, it's stuck with me forever, your open-handed colleagues have given the go-ahead for typesetting, and so you can go ahead and do that. Well, it was typeset, and it wound up going through 3 editions. It was the only one of our volumes that did that, and it must have been something about the blueprint part of it, or having all the measures in a long appendix at the end that sold the book. In any case, that got us started. Now, we did publish first volume findings in Volume 2, with me as the sole author. And golly, I can make this work. There it is. No, that's the third one. Never mind. We'll get to that. Well, anyhow, Bob's contribution to Volume 2 was to read over my whole manuscript and edit it carefully, and it made it much more. In fact, let's see, I said in the acknowledgments, I deeply appreciate Robert Kahn's careful editing of nearly all of the manuscript. He's done much to make the final product more readable. It was a very generous and helpful contribution for a non-author in the early stages of our project. Now, Volume 3, and that's up there now, was entitled Dropping Out Problem or Symptom. And that sort of hinted at a lot of the findings. Bob's contributions were again recognized in the acknowledgments, and I'll read what we said. The Youth in Transition project began in 1965 with Gerald Bachman and Robert Kahn as principal investigators. Since that time, Bob Kahn has been involved in a wide range of research activities and administrative responsibilities. he has nevertheless maintained an interest and involvement throughout the lifespan of the project. And I had wished it had been more, but he was busy with all these other things. His investment throughout the lifespan of the project, it continues, made the present volume, well, it began with his share in the initial planning and launching of the research, continued through the years of data collection and analysis, and included his very helpful review of this manuscript. These and many other contributions to the Youth in Transition Project are deeply appreciated. I'll share just one finding from Volume 3. There it is. We had 4 data collections at the time of that writing, one more than initially planned, and the extra data collection, which was Wave 3 at the end of high school, makes an interesting part of the story, but let me first point out what the figure shows. We included a measure of self-esteem in all of the data collections, and at this point in the study, 1 year after high school, we could see on the right side of the, I could use this pointer, but, well, you can see the right side without my pointer. In any case, you can see 1 year after high school that those who went into college had the highest self-esteem, whereas those who dropped out of high school were the lowest. But this doesn't seem like the differences were the consequences of dropping out or going to college, because the left side of the figure shows that those differences were present, and perhaps even larger, when the young men were starting 10th grade. This is just one example of what appeared throughout that Volume 3. Dropping out was more of a symptom of earlier problems rather than a new problem. Now, a word about that extra Wave 3 data collection at the end of high school. In late 1968, just after Richard Nixon had been elected on a platform that included ending the military draft, the Department of Defense was looking for nationally representative surveys of young men, and there we were. This is one of first of several confirmation of Leslie Kish's forecast that folks would be more interested if our data were nationally representative. Well, our conversations with DoD representatives led to the idea of adding a data collection to explore young men's reaction to various incentives that might make it more attractive for them to volunteer for military service. But first, we had to persuade our colleagues of the wisdom of accepting military money for this proposed addition to Youth in Transition, given that we were at the height of growing dissatisfaction with the Vietnam War, which was, of course, already rampant at ISR. Bob helped persuade folks here that funding a new Wave 3 of Youth in Transition would be a far better use of military money than buying a few more barrels of napalm, etc. And in addition to learning about possible incentives for an all-volunteer force, we gained another wave of the core measures for the Youth in Transition study and another example of opportunism. Now, I'll turn to Wave 4 of Youth in Transition. It occurred in 1970 as planned, 1 year after high school, for most of our samples who had graduated, and we repeated many of the measures from the earlier waves and also included a new set of measures because Lloyd Johnston and Jerry Johnston, another graduate student working on Youth in Transition, no relation to Lloyd, they persuaded me and others that Wave 5 should include measures of drug use, since that seemed to be a growing set of problems among youth. That's turned out to be a hugely important step, as will become clear later. We were able to obtain funding for a Wave 5 of Youth in Transition following the original panel to 1974, when most of them were 5 years beyond high school. This doubled the longitudinal span to 8 years, and several years of that data collection we published in Volume 6 of the Youth in Transition series. Well, can't win them all. There it is. So that was Volume 6. And I want to show you a few key findings from that. Well, there it is. There's self-esteem again. Now, with 4 more years in our longitudinal span, we could distinguish 6 levels of education. And if you can't read them down there, it's dropouts, high school grads with no college, some with college but no degree, those with an associate degree, those with a bachelor degree, and those with some graduate work. And the self-esteem scores 5 years after high school, there on the right, clearly rank order just the same as educational attainment. But back at the start of 10th grade, the same ordering is evident and actually larger. So the self-esteem at all 6 levels of education rose appreciably in the high school years. And at the same time that our young men experienced rising self-esteem from what were modal ages 15 through 23, they also experienced a declining trust in government. Now, are both of these age-related changes maturation? Well, turns out there were a lot of other surveys available, cross-sectional surveys of the nation as a whole, and the whole nation experienced a declining trust in government from 1966 to 1974. So that's an illustration, and it was very important in my thinking, of a single panel study spanning a particular historical time and not being able to disentangle whether it was a maturation or a secular trend. And so I'll show you a couple more findings, and then we'll get back to that. There, first drug data, cigarette smoking. And at the start of, well, at the end of 10th grade, which was 1969, and we didn't actually measure those data until the 1970. We had a retrospective measure of drug use of a bunch of different drugs in the 1970 data collection, and so we included the 1969 data there, and you can see that orders by educational attainment very clearly, loud and clear. In fact, Leslie Kish, this was a favorite slide of his, because he says you don't get differences that big ordinarily in social science. So that was, and let's see. Well, look at the next one. And there's alcohol. And that shows links to educational attainment. And at the end of when most of them were in high school, they again ordered neatly by educational attainment, this time opposite of self-esteem. That is, greatest use by the dropouts and the least use by those who got into graduate work. Now, they all went up appreciably after that, and they got more similar because the college experience led to more alcohol use. Well, see where I am. Yes. I want to note Bob Kahn's contribution to Volume 6. He had not been as much involved. Again, I wish that he could have been more, but he was doing lots of other things, including he was doing a lot of work with Tony. And I was jealous of Tony. She had more Bob Kahn than I did during that time. Maybe, I like to think he thought we were doing all right without him. But in any case, I want to note his contribution to Volume 6. He wrote a great 3-page foreword to Volume 6, and I'll quote a few highlights. After noting our longitudinal study, like earlier cross-sectional studies, had not found much in the way of different high school effects, Bob commented on our findings as follows. The main explanation for lack of differential high school effects, however, is the importance of earlier factors. The importance of those factors seems to me to be the central theme of this book and several of the monographs that preceded it. The high school experience seems neither to exacerbate nor repair the effects of such factors. For me, the inference is to start earlier, both for purposes of explanation and for purposes of change. The closing remarks in Bob's foreword included these words. Many of the data in this research are appropriately archived and are available to interested scholars who are likely to continue to publish from this source. And he was very correct. There's been a lot of publishing from the archived Youth in Transition panel data. He then went on to say, those are future possibilities, however. My purpose in this foreword is to offer some appreciation for past accomplishments and commend them to readers. I do so with pleasure. Now, those excerpts from that 3-page foreword really capture a whole lot of what we did in three or 6 volumes, and did it beautifully, as Bob always did when he wrote something. Now, that Youth in Transition Volume 6 took advantage of all 5 waves of the longitudinal study. 5 years earlier, in 1973, Lloyd Johnston took the first 4 waves and published Drugs in American Youth. And I'll show you that one. There it is. Now, Lloyd's book was not typeset, but it had the jazziest cover, and it was a considerable success. Now, what does all this have to do with monitoring the future? Well, based on the Youth in Transition experiences, I conceived a design for a more ambitious ongoing social indicator study of youth and young adults. And I invited Lloyd to join me in developing what eventually became the Monitoring the Future Project, or MTF. The initial design was to survey high school seniors, both male and female. We were not going to make that gender mistake again, you see. And then follow a subset of respondents from each class, each high school graduating class, into adulthood. Our Youth in Transition experience had shown that we could do that successfully, and the idea of repeating it year after year meant we could avoid the limitations of a single cohort. We could disentangle age, period, and cohort effects. It also meant, this design with repeated data collections, not coincidentally, job security for the principal investigators and the staff. And indeed, it has. Well, Bob helped us earlier in trying to get funding for Monitoring the Future as originally conceived, but our efforts to find funders for a wide-ranging study of the lifestyle and values of youth was not successful. Now enter Robert DuPont, MD, the director of the White House Special Action Office on Drug Abuse Prevention, or SAODAP for short. DuPont had read Lloyd's book and wanted to have SAODAP help to ensure that the Youth in Transition study would continue its measurement of drug use. We said, great, but you might really like Monitoring the Future. Well, he did. And SAODAP provided funding for both studies. Then, with the advent of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, with Bob DuPont as its first head, we got further funding that has now extended for more than 4 decades. Indeed, I sometimes tell folks that I've been living more than half of my life on drug money. That job security part really worked out very nicely for both of us. Now, given our new funding from SAODAP and then NIDA, the measures of drug use and related attitudes gained a good deal more space in monitoring the future surveys than had originally been planned. Nevertheless, we were able to include a lot of other items that were of interest to us. We told the sponsors that including those items would make the surveys more interesting to respondents, not to mention the principal investigators. But what was Bob Kahn's involvement in monitoring the future? He did help in our initial efforts to get it funded. But most important was his work on youth and transition, because without YIT, the MTF project would not have happened. I'll share just one set of findings from MTF. And we liked them so much we put them on the book cover. And they show that by following high school, well, no, I've gotten ahead of my story. This is too tempting. So we'll get to that. But first I have to explain that we first were just following high school seniors into adulthood. Then, starting in 1991, the study expanded to include 8th and 10th grade cross sections, and we couldn't resist the temptation to try to follow some of those 8th graders longitudinally, because it started earlier than youth and transition, had males and females, and we could get an earlier look at drug use. Well, we oversampled. One of the reasons for doing this is we wanted to get better samples of dropouts. And in our original Monitoring the Future study that started at the end of 12th grade, the dropouts were gone. So 8th graders were there before practically any of them dropped out. But the data that they gave us in 8th grade enabled us to predict rather well who was going to drop out. So we oversampled the dropouts, figuring we'd get some dropout samples at the end of this. Well, it turns out that not only could we predict dropping out of school very well, but we could also predict dropping out of the study. We had overall quite decent response rates, but lousy response rates from the dropouts. And so after several years, I guess 3 years, we, and following up those first 3 cohorts, we decided, well, that wasn't a very good use of NIDA's money, and we really should stop trying to follow up these folks. But by that time, we had collected a fair amount of data on those first 3 8th grade samples from the cohorts, 8th grades of 1991, 2, and 3. So we decided, well, we'd at least follow them, because a whole lot of them were participating, just not the dropouts, at least not as many of the dropouts as we wanted. So that's what we did, and that's what gave rise to this 3rd book in the Monitoring the Future series, which wasn't published by ISI, it was published by Eurobond. So we wrote the book primarily based on those findings. We were able to revisit lots of the youth and transition things, including the dropout stuff, which came out just about the same. And I don't show that. But there's the cigarette findings. And starting at as early as late 8th grade, there weren't as many smokers, but we could predict them quite well. And now we'll see that we predicted them about the same. Well, it worked about the same for males and females. No appreciable differences there. And even though the gaps don't look as large, at least for males, back at age 14, the correlation coefficients are just as strong. I mean, overall, there was less smoking, but the differentiation was still substantial. Well, that finding, by the way, was a favorite of Leslie Kish's. Now, I think that was partly because his wife was still smoking, and he wanted to show Rhea these findings. In any case, he liked it because that was another instance of getting bigger differences than you usually get in survey research. Well, now I've covered a little bit of the monitoring the future findings, but that was after Bob's major contribution. So now let me go back to some of my other experiences with Bob. During our times together in the early days of Youth in Transition and all the years that followed, I've greatly enjoyed and respected Bob, not only as a social scientist, but also as a grand friend and companion. Along the way, I discovered that we had many extracurricular things in common, ranging from worldviews to a love of sailing. Now, I have vague recollections of seeing Bob's 16-foot sailboat on its trailer in his driveway, roughly half a century ago. At that point, I owned a somewhat similar sailboat, and later I owned a couple larger ones. Bob, however, downsized eventually to a 14-foot sunfish, which he kept at their cottage at North Lake. At Torch Lake. North Lake is where I live. So on one occasion, in gathering the then SRC director, in a gathering at Bob Grove's house, when he was the director of SRC and hosted these things, Bob arrived after I did, but he couldn't wait to run over and tell me that he had his first sailboat capsized. He and daughter Marcia stayed with a capsized boat for 45 minutes before being rescued. And I asked Marcia this morning, why didn't you just right the sailboat? She said, no, the sail collected too much water and we couldn't get it back up. Which might have been cleated. That would have done it. If they're not cleated, it works better. Don't ask me how I know that. So, anyhow, I told Bob, this was in Torch Lake, by the way, and you all know where that is in the upper portion of the Lower Peninsula. And Torch Lake is large and deep, and I don't know if it ever gets very warm, and Marcia told me this morning that it certainly didn't the day they spent 45 minutes halfway submerged in it. So I told Bob, I was far ahead of him, and I had capsized a number of different boats, including a sunfish or something like it. At some point later on, Bob told me that he had downsized further to a kayak, which is just the thing for maintaining his fitness. I had the great pleasure of taking Bob sailing several times at my home on the far smaller and warmer North Lake, which is just 20 miles west-northwest of here. And no danger of capsize on those occasions because this boat was a trimaran, so 3 hulls, very stable. Nevertheless, our wives opted to remain on shore and enjoy us from land, but those were fun times. Now, one final thought. There are 3 people in my life who have played crucial roles in my academic and scientific development, and Bob Kahn is at the top of that list. I could not have asked for a warmer or more constructive mentor as I got started doing longitudinal survey research. This symposium is a great and richly deserved tribute to a wonderful, widely loved colleague and friend of most of us in the room.
Ask a question? Come up to the mic, please.
How old was he when he was sitting on top of the sunfish?
Only 1 year is working, Steve.
How old was Bob Kahn when he was on the sunfish?
How old on the sunfish?
How old was he?
Well, ask Marcia. How he would have been,
Had been
that was more than a decade ago, wasn't it? Or was
not much for.
Yeah, right. So he would have been 90, give or take.
Oh, that's right.
On the theme of sailing and kayaking, we were once at an event where they had those, group creating feelings. And everybody got in a rowboat or a kayak. I can't remember which. I'm not very good at either one of them. But Bob and I were in the same boat. And it was an aging-related conference. And the theme was, the prize winner was the oldest cumulative years in a boat. Bob and I won.
I just wanted to make a comment off the topic, and that's to say that Lloyd and Jerry ought to be congratulated for paying for half of this building over 50 years, and that the soul of Angus Campbell, wherever he is, has a beatific smile on his face.
Well, I'm happy that there is a little time left for me to make some comments. I told you when we started this part of the program that I would wait to see and hopefully would have time to make some comments, and I am very happy to do so. And I really want to share some memories that I thought about as I was thinking about this symposium, and some memories that come back to me as we heard other comments. But first, to go back to the issue of the founders. So it was a great gamble when they came, because they did forego overhead from the university or any general funds, but then they kept their overhead, which was really quite a gamble. Another point that people don't remember about that crowd of real mavericks was they also refused departmental appointments. So many of us now take a more cautionary approach, and we have a joint appointment. And that might not sound like a big deal, but it is a big deal in a soft money world, because it means you have a hard line somewhere. Many of us with retreat rights, some of us with partial appointments, but it meant that you didn't have to bring in your 100% salary. These mavericks said, no, we don't want it, forget it. And these were not people who couldn't get those appointments. Remember, these were really the best of the bunch. These were really great thinkers doing pioneering work, really creating new pathways in their various fields. And they said they'd live and die on what they could bring in. I think we forget that. I mean, I would say it's a little easier. It was a little easier to get money then than it is now, but still, that was a big statement, a big step. And I've always been really impressed about that. And I think that stayed with us for years. There was a point at which we began to encourage joint appointments, but I think we should remember that, because it just goes to show what a maverick that crowd was. So let me give you a few random memories, which I hope will be fun for you. And they are certainly fun for me as I think about it. One was, and somebody alluded to this, the lunches, the peanut butter and